Welcome to this episode of the Canada History Society series on British Columbia and Confederation. In this fifth episode of the Canada History Society's 20-part series, we explore local politics in BC, who we were. When gold was struck in 1857, both Vancouver Island and the Mainland were thrown into sudden upheaval. Once quiet fur trading outposts under loose Hudson Bay Company control now drew mass immigration and international attention. Margaret Ormsby famously described the social and political clash as one between a closed hierarchical model of society represented by the Hudson's Bay Company and colonial officials and the open, egalitarian vision of English and Canadian settlers. That ideological divide shaped the political terrain that followed. On one side stood the HBC and colonial governors like James Douglas and Frederick Seymour, determined to uphold British imperial authority. On the other stood reformers such as Arthur de Cosmo and John Robson, supported by thousands of newcomers from Eastern Canada and the United States, who brought with them expectations of representative government and democratic accountability. In this increasingly volatile landscape, four main political factions emerged. First were the Imperial Conservatives, centered around the HBC and government appointees. Resistant to democratization, they relied on the British Navy, described by historian Barry Goff as acting like colonial policemen to enforce order and dismantle practices like Indigenous slavery. Seymour, Goff notes, viewed representative government with deep suspicion and saw the 1866 colonial amalgamation not as a democratic reform, but as an administrative necessity. Opposing them were the reformers, de Cosmos, who condemned the entrenched family-company compact, championed responsible government and a new Canadian future. The people of the country aspire to and have the capacity for self-government, he declared. Alongside John Robson, he co-founded the Confederation League in 1866, pushing for union with the newly formed Dominion of Canada. Their movement redirected political energy from annexationist sentiment towards a vision of national integration based on public meetings, newspaper campaigns, and proposals like Canadian assumption of colonial debt and the construction of a transcontinental railway. A third, more pragmatic group comprised Victoria and New Westminster merchants. Burdened by mounting debts and unprofitable infrastructure like the Caribou Wagon Road, some began advocating annexation to the U.S. Their motivations, historians argue, were economic, not ideological. The appeal of American prosperity grew amid British financial neglect and administrative inaction.
When the miners arrived, as they did from San Francisco, and between June, July, and August of 1858, 8 steamers were coming on a regular passage to and from San Francisco, bringing in the gold seekers, bringing in supplies, and then returning often with persons who were disheartened, who had lost everything. The yields were not as dramatically great for many people as they were. Indeed, there's been an argument put forward, possibly a very good one, that the Californians had come north because the yields from the Sacramento had been poor. And indeed, I'm sure that there were a lot of heartaches that existed by those miners who were coming out of the Fraser River Canyon area, who had not been able to exploit gold and do it by gold panning.
The fourth and most marginalized faction were Indigenous people. Despite their continued demographic strength, they were excluded from colonial governance. Governor Douglas had signed the Douglas Treaties, offering nominal land and hunting rights on Vancouver Island, but these efforts were abandoned by his successors. Seymour's administration marked a shift from fragile coexistence to active displacement. The Chilcotin Uprising of 1864 symbolized a policy of suppression. Lands were taken without treaties. Indigenous communities were confined or pushed into remoteness. Their political voice, already silenced institutionally, was now being forcibly erased. By the mid-1860s, economic and political pressures reached a tipping point. The costs of projects like the Caribou Wagon Road, coupled with the burden of maintaining two colonial governments, pushed the colony to the brink. Seymour himself called the administration setup extremely inconvenient. Declining gold revenues deepened the crisis. Reformers used the moment to intensify calls for responsible government and confederation, arguing that British Columbia could only modernize and survive through union with Canada. Historian Gene Barman calls 1858 a decisive turning point. It was the year when British Columbia, with some certainty, did not end up sliding into the American orbit. Despite annexationist leanings and fiscal desperation, the colony increasingly aligned itself with the vision of British North America. This shift was not inevitable, but driven by reformers' efforts and a recalibrating political order. By November 1866, the Colonial Office in London ordered the amalgamation of Vancouver Island and British Columbia. It was not a democratic victory, but an austerity measure to streamline governance. Imperial conservatives embraced it as a way to reinforce British control. Reformers, however, recast the merger as a step toward confederation, public accountability, and self-rule. As political tensions escalated, it became clear that the fate of the Pacific colony would be shaped not solely by Britain or America, but by its own competing internal forces. In the crucible of gold, debt, and competing ideologies, British Columbia was being reshaped. Whether it would become an American satellite, an imperial stronghold, or a Canadian province remained uncertain, but the decisive forces were already in motion. By 1866, the colony's fractured political landscape had taken clear shape. The gold rush, overlapping governments, and mounting debts had crystallized alliances and brought underlying ideologies to the surface. British Columbia was not only a space of imperial interest, but a contested ground for different visions of governance and identity.
And the British government was saying, all right, you've had a good start, and now you're on your own. So when the 1860s come along, we have a totally different political scenario in which the politics begin to turn on the need for executive power. And the separate colonies, the one hand Vancouver Island, the other one British Columbia, are in an arduous destiny trying to work out how it should be done until such time as the union of the two is proclaimed, with the headquarters in Victoria and a very reluctant and sad Queen City of New Westminster complaining about that.
At the center stood imperial conservatives like Douglas and Seymour. Douglas, despite his mixed Scottish and West Indian heritage, upheld top-down governance rooted in hierarchy and order. Seymour, arriving in 1864, rejected democracy outright. As Barry Goff notes, Seymour believed the colony was only a colony in name, and governance should remain in the hands of a few who understood empire. These men saw themselves as a bulwark against American-style republicanism, favoring imperial command over local autonomy. In contrast, reformers like Armand de Cosmo and John Robson emerged from journalism and civic life. De Cosmo, founder of the British colonists, reinvented himself as a lover of the universe and became a passionate advocate for union with Canada. Robson, editor of the British Columbian, echoed this push for democratic reform and modernization. The Confederation League, founded in 1866, promoted a participatory version of government, rooted in national unity. As Ormsby wrote, a new and confident colonial society was asserting itself. Would this Western colony become an American state, a British imperial outpost, or something new? The question remained open in 1866, but the financial collapse and rising reformist pressure turned British Columbia away from annexation and toward the promise of Canadian Confederation. As Ormsby, Gough, and Barman all emphasized, this pivotal decade, marked by gold fever and economic collapse, did not lead to American subjugation, but to the forging of a uniquely Canadian political identity. Join us next time for Part 6 of the Canada History Society's 20-part series as we explore Canadian Confederation, the birth of a nation.